Our next speaker is Mark Kaib, and Mark is currently the Deputy Regional Fire Management Coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Southwest region in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And Mark began his career in fire as an Arizona hotshot crew member for the U.S. Forest Service in 1982. He worked on other hotshot crews, engine crews, helitack for the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, and the Bureau of Land Management in Alaska. He's had the fortune to be a hotshot superintendent and also to work in Alaska with Native American crews for the Alaska Fire Service. And he entered graduate school in 1994, where he investigated land use and fire history in both mixed conifer pine oak woodlands and also in semi-desert grassland ecosystems. His research areas in the northern Sierra Madres includes a multidisciplinary approach to reconstruct forest history and cultural patterns using tree ring evidence, documentary sources, and ethnographical methods. In his current job, he applies fire research and management experience to support the refuge, prescribed fire, and wildlife habitat management programs. And he's actively involved in regional fire and fuel monitoring, planning and implementation, research and development, outreach, education, and emergency fire stabilization and rehabilitation. Those are his current projects and responsibilities. And I'm going to turn this over now to Mark. So thank you for your patience with the technical difficulties.
Thank you very much, David. It's a real honor to be a small part of this educational opportunity. Can you see my PowerPoint presentation at this stage?
Yes, we can.
Great. So the title of my brief presentation is the Fish and Wildlife Service Fire Mantra, Keeping Fire on Our Side, Climate Change and Fire Management Considerations. And I'd just like to point you to the website at the bottom of this page. This is the Fish and Wildlife Climate Change website, and you can obtain information on the landscape conservation cooperatives, the Fish and Wildlife Service Inventory and Monitoring Program, and also our Climate Change Strategic Plan on that site. I'd like to go ahead and I'm trying to provide a management perspective and in context of some of the backdrop of the research science that has shown the changes in fire in the Southwest and throughout the West. And this graphic here shows the increase in our annual area burned here in the West and the Southwest, and the dramatic or exponential increase in area burned over the last 30 to 40 years. And I'm going to have to give Dr. Swetnam some credit. I have borrowed some of his slides, and I'm sure he'll be elaborating on some of this information in his talk. What we're seeing through from the research is an increase in the wildfire frequency since the 1970s. Also, a much earlier timing of spring snowmelt, and the increase in the fire season length over the same time period. So these are the challenges that many of the fire managers are trying to face on the ground, whether while implementing prescribed fire or out dealing with wildland fire management. And so the winters are drier, the springs are warmer, the snow's melting earlier. We've got drier soils earlier in the summer, a longer dry season, drier vegetation. It all translates to more fires and more severe fires. And so it's manifested itself in the Southwest with some pretty drastic changes in the fire behavior that we're seeing on the ground. Places and forests that once experienced surface fire are now experiencing stand replacement fire and fires of high severity that burn for weeks and months at a time over hundreds of thousands of acres. And this has been an unusual change that we've seen in the last 10 to 20 years that is unusual in a historical context and from a management perspective. And these high severity fires are also manifesting themselves in watershed effects downstream and also vegetation changes. And so these are the things that managers are seeing on the ground and that are surely connected to the climate warming and climate change that's being documented at grander scales at the global level and hemispheric levels. And this is just downstream from one of those fires that was shown in the Chiricahua Mountains, and a 15-meter gully eroded that filled in a recreational lake further downstream. Soil layers that are hundreds of thousands of years old, suggesting how anomalous these types of fire events were in geologic history. The other environmental stressors that are interacting with the warming and the changing fire include forest pathogens and insects. This is a photo from Craig Allen that depicts the widespread beetle kill in central New Mexico. Also, some of the other ecological stressors include these fire-adaptive invasive species we see taking over in areas and completely converting ecosystems to something completely different, often monocultures. And so the manager has a real challenge these days on the ground. Most of these climate models and forecasts are at continental scales, national, rarely at the regional level. It's difficult to incorporate a climate forecast, increased temperature of 2 degrees to a prescribed burn that we're going to do next season. And so we're in dire need of more research, the downscaling of these models to the management unit or levels that we can actually apply that information to. And that would be at the ecosystem level, at a vegetation type or a fuel type. And that's what I'm hearing from the managers that would be very useful from the research community. When we're looking at some of the global climate models, this is getting to the scale that the managers could potentially use when we're breaking these down and modeling changes in vegetation. But even a finer scale is what I think a lot of the managers are using, and particularly with the Fish and Wildlife Service, our refuges are relatively small compared to the other agencies, and so we need information that we can, at a grassland, at a forest or woodland scale, for different fuel types and that sort of thing. Because these are the scales that we're working on. We're working on scales that incorporate fuels and topography and weather, the fire triangle stuff, vegetation layers, and shorter-term climate patterns. And what we really are interested in knowing more about is not only the changes that are going to occur to those different vegetation or fuel types, but also changes that are going to occur to fire regimes and some of these attributes here: frequency, intensity, severity, the spatial scale, things like that. Some of the patterns here in the Southwest that are beginning to emerge and no doubt are influenced by climate warming are the exotic invasive species, for example, bufflegrass and red brome grass that are taking over the Sonoran Desert, where fire historically has been extremely rare. And these fire-adapted grass species from Africa and other places are providing a fuel bed that can support frequent high-intensity fire that is removing the keystone species, the saguaro, from these desert landscapes. And so the impacts are immense. This is a bufflegrass fuel load right here, and then also the changes in expansion of the wildland-urban interface has become significant, and the loss of homes and the impact to communities in the recent decade or two, it's just escalated. And so it's a real challenge for fire managers these days, and the fear is that, and the trend that we're seeing is that many of our resources and our firefighters that work for the agencies, and their primary role is the agency mission, restoring fire-adapted ecosystems and such, maintaining those natural resources. They're being pulled out of the parks and forests, and those resources are going to be shifted to help protect communities. And so how are we going to get that other work done on our refuges, the work at restoring fire-adapted ecosystems and preparing these ecosystems to be more resilient and less vulnerable to climate change is going to be a real challenge. And so it's a dry heat in Arizona, and hopefully we probably aren't going to see a big fire season this year, but we'll see. It looks like we've got quite a fuel load in the grasslands. My region also includes the Gulf Coast of Texas, and along the entire Gulf Coast, we're seeing huge changes in ecological function, and mainly through saltwater intrusion and the increased frequency of hurricanes. But what we are finding through our monitoring work is that the areas that have been burned most recently are actually responding the best after these hurricanes and saltwater intrusions, suggesting that maybe our management activities are still in the right context, and we are still achieving our resource objectives there. Up in Alaska and on the periphery of these environmental gradients at the higher latitudes, at the tops of mountains, and on the coast, we're seeing the most drastic implications and changes from the climate warming. Here's a map of Alaska of the fire history between 1950 and 2007, and this is time since the last fire. And what you see here is, 40 or 50 years ago there were some large fires, but in the last 10 years the majority of these large fires have occurred, and this is a pretty significant change in the fire history in Alaska, up in the Tussock tundra region. And so up there we're seeing a real shift in the fire ecology and fire effects, and we're starting to see, because of the change in the albedo effect from these burned areas, the permafrost melting and vegetation change occurring, where we're getting the black spruce tundra dropping out, and we're starting to get deciduous trees moving into these areas. So this is something that, as managers, we really need to watch and do a better job at monitoring. We may get to the point in some areas where we need to actually suppress fires in areas that were once fire-adapted ecosystems. And so what can we do? It's really daunting, but I think many of the managers are assuming that everything we're doing right now, the fuel reduction treatments and prescribed fire in most places, are probably the right thing in the context of climate change. We think that we are building resilience and resistance in these systems to warming and other environmental stressors. But we do need better monitoring. We need better research to independently verify those assumptions. And so what can we do? Well, mitigation options are one option, and these are actions that enable ecosystems to reduce, let me see here, to reduce anthropogenic influence on climate, management options to sequester carbon and reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions. And then another example of a mitigation option is management that reduces ecological and watershed impacts. So, you know, we need to look at options to mitigate the effects of climate change and maybe in fire ways to sequester more carbon on the landscape. And that can be done through prescribed fire, but also looking at innovative ways to deal with fuels. And it could be maybe bearing fuels to sequester that carbon, or looking at new technologies like cogenerators for heat and electricity. Additionally, the work by Herto and others on carbon accounting has been very helpful, and we need a lot more information on that specific to different ecosystems, in particular the grasslands and non-forested ecosystems. Can we do thinning or prescribed fire or other treatments to reduce the loss of carbon from high severity wildfire? It's not the most carbon that wins here. It's the most sustainable carbon is what we're learning. And we're also learning that charcoal carbon is very important. It's the most persistent form of carbon. You can't have it without fire. And it's sequestered for centuries and millennia in the soils. And so the emerging science is coming quick, but it's timely and necessary. So management activities that keep fire on the ground and reduce the impacts of high severity fire effects to watersheds. What else can we do? Well, there's adaptation options, and you know, I think for managers this is all new dialogue, so helping create a common dialogue with these climate change terms is one of our challenges. Adaptation options include actions that help ecosystems accommodate to changes. They create resistance to change, and they promote resilience to change, and they enable ecosystems to respond better to climate stressors, environmental stressors, and climate warming. And so many of the things that we're doing in places are hopefully and likely going to turn out to be advantageous and adaptation strategies. But like I said, the monitoring and the research is going to be crucial to help us demonstrate that and to lead the way for the future. And so, you know, from Herto's work, once again, creating forests that resemble pre-settlement conditions where most of the carbon is stored in the larger trees and below ground, where it's not lost from a fire that moves through, versus the current situation in the West with you know, decades of suppression in the doghair thickets, where we're seeing just a large carbon losses from wildfires. In the arid lands in particular, water is going to become an increasing issue, and the connection between good watershed management, restoring fire-adapted ecosystems, and that water quantity and quality are going to be crucial to meet our water needs in the future. Some of the work done in the Great Plains adaptation strategies, basically creating multiple successional stages and different habitats over the entire landscape, that mosaic that we talk about, to accommodate greater biological diversity and the needs of different bird species and other wildlife taxon to maintain that diversity and function across the greater landscape. And then, you know, lastly, I think the triage approach, because our resources are limited. We can't afford to have everything as a priority. We need to begin to look at prioritizing ecosystems and landscape based on community values and relative ecological services. What are the values of the multiple ecological services out there that we are managing? And then conduct work in places where treatments increase resistance and resilience and are likely to be most effective. And so better incorporation of adaptive management is crucial in the context of the changes we've seen in the last couple decades. Learning from our experience, doing better monitoring, having early warning systems that can tell us when we're no longer meeting management objectives, and then also hand in hand with the academic community to help answer those more complex questions. And so some of the research needs are wild cards here, things that are still uncertain, is how the climate change is going to affect regional lightning and ignition patterns. You know, we may get lightning in new regions, in places where we haven't seen high densities of lightning in the past. Wind patterns are going to change as well. Fire-adapted exotic invasives are really seem to be taking off in some areas and causing huge problems. So identifying those early on and taking action, and also accepting some of those that are out of control now, and really just allocating resources into different areas, because we're going to accept those as new natives, or perhaps maybe as a last resort looking for biological control of some of these invasives. The warming and the increase in forest and woodland insects and pathogens, huge diebacks, and the synergy and interaction between these changing fuels and fire, increase in extreme weather events, the question about charcoal carbon and soils, and learning how our management activities are changing the carbon sequestration in those areas. Black carbon emissions from prescribed end wildfires. Where do these smoke columns and the black carbon end up, and how is that providing biological feedback or positive feedback into the climate warming? These are a lot of uncertainties and unknowns right now that we need additional research on. Vulnerability assessments for particular ecosystems is another one. And so with that, I'll go ahead and stop, and I want to thank everyone for this opportunity, and I'd like to also acknowledge the Wildland Lessons Learned Center, the International Association of Wildland Firefighters, the Joint Fire Science Program for partly funding this research, and the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research.
Thank you very much, Mark. I just want to remind people that we will be taking questions towards the end, and that you should submit your questions to the panelists electronically. We also have done 2 polls. We've done 2 polls thus far. I'd like to show the results of the second poll. Basically, this is asking whether we have monitoring programs in place. Currently, 40% have indicated yes, that their unit is indeed doing some monitoring on climate change, and 60% have actually said no. I'd like to initiate a third poll with your help right now. This is what is the biggest challenge that your unit is facing? And if you just take a few minutes to go ahead and fill this in, we'd really appreciate it. There's currently over 107 people on this phone call. I shouldn't say 107 people. We have 107 computers connected, but we're not quite exactly sure how many people are sharing resources to get online here. But we'd love to get some feedback, and this is one way to get feedback through the polls. So we really appreciate your time. And there's also going to be a post-survey questionnaire towards the end, at the end of this webinar, 5 quick questions that will help us in planning this for the future. So while people respond to this poll, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Our next panelist is a very distinguished researcher from the Tree Ring Lab, Dr. Tom Swetnam. Tom is a professor of dendrochronology, and he is director of the world's first and largest laboratory dedicated to the aspects of tree ring investigation. That's the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona Tucson. And Tom has studied tree rings in the world's largest and oldest trees, giant sequoias and bristlecone pines. His tree ring studies track the history of forest fires, insect outbreaks, and climate over the past 3,000 years. And this work is really aimed at understanding the dynamics of forests and woodland ecosystems and the role and interactions of climate and humans. He's traveled and studied tree rings across North and South America and also in Siberia, Russia. And Tom has published more than 120 scientific papers, and he's received awards for his published research from the Ecological Society of America, ESA, and the American Association of Geographers. He has served on several panels and boards, including the presidential and Arizona state governor appointed board panel, and he's testified to Congress on 4 occasions. He's also served as major advisor for 23 doctoral and master's students and mentored 5 postdoc scientists. And Tom and his colleagues' findings have been highlighted in numerous media outlets, including the New York Times, most recently an issue of the National Geographic magazine, and there's also an interview of Dr. Swetnam in a 60 Minutes CBS segment on climate change and forest fires. Without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Tom Swetnam.
Okay.
Hold on, I think I need to stop the poll here 1 second.
Well, thank you, David, and both David's there, and Chuck and Josh for inviting me. My pleasure, an honor to be involved. Let me ask you real quick, David, how are we doing for time?
We're doing very well, so okay. We're all right on track.
Okay, I'll be relatively brief here. Thanks to my co-presenters, it made my job quite easy here. Very thorough, I think, and comprehensive talks that have really, I think, captured many of the issues. And so, I think what I'll be speaking on is a little more, a little narrower, a little more focused on some issues of fire history and fire climate, and some of the tools and some of the research that's currently underway. A bit more of a focus on North America, and particularly the western U.S., and just some various issues I think that have been talked about already, but maybe a bit more detail. Part of my purpose here will be to highlight some papers and recent publications, and also some online tools that people can access. So first of all, this first image, which I presume you can see, is one I think that Mark showed a few minutes ago. And the importance of scale, and this has come up in several of the panelists' talks in the last few minutes, and the understanding that climate variability, climate change is generally occurring at these longer time scales and broader spatial scales, and it is distinct from fire meteorology, which we're more familiar with, the day-to-day changes in weather, and from a fire management perspective and fire behavior perspective, firefighters and fire managers are much more familiar with the the concepts of fire meteorology and fire weather indices. And actually over the history of research in the area of atmospheric sciences and fire, it's really at these lower two triangles at the lower left where most of the research and most of the understanding has been done. We're, I think, now just really beginning to develop the field of fire climatology, and we have a ways to go. It's just broader spatial and longer temporal scales, and part of the reason that we're just now getting to these broader, longer scales is that it takes a while to build up the records and to accumulate the time series records and to get the broader spatial coverages that we now have from satellites, for example. So a little discussion of fire history. There's increasing availability of longer records that have helped us explore fire-climate relationships, and tree ring records generally for the western U.S. give us 300 to 500 years, and there's increasing numbers of chronologies, tree ring chronologies from Canada, parts of South America, and Europe, and elsewhere that are starting to fill out the records of these past centuries of fire history with pretty high resolution. It's an unusual case, the giant sequoias shown here, where we can get a couple of thousand years or 2,000 or 3,000 years of record. The charcoal-based fire histories are actually more extensive globally than the tree ring-based fire history records, and there's been very good progress in the last few years in pulling together broad-scale networks of both tree ring and charcoal records, and charcoal records at the global scale that can look at fire regime and fire climate relationships over millennia. And I think Bill Sommers showed a graphic from one of the studies from Marlin et al. That used the charcoal record. The tree ring record, this is just an example of the western U.S. on the right, showing the distribution of tree ring sites in the western states and in Mexico, is becoming relatively well spatially distributed. Some big holes like the Great Basin and the deserts and out in the plains, of course. But we're beginning to get enough records that we can begin to look at these broad spatial patterns. And also, the access to these data is generally pretty good and getting better. You'll note at the bottom of this screen you can see a web link to this database. It's an online database where you can search on location and species, and you can zoom in on the tools there with various maps to find the availability of fire history data sets. And I think these sorts of data sets and their usability and the kind of tools that are useful for managers and for planners and researchers to access these data are just going to improve with time. This is the charcoal, the global charcoal data set. Now I believe it's over 900 records in this data set, and there have been a couple of very interesting papers recently published looking at the fire history over the last 10,000 or so years with these records, showing some very interesting climate changes. And I didn't put the reference on here, but it's Marlin et al. In the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences is one of the publications from this. Here's a special issue in the International Journal of Wildland and Fire that pulled together 10 papers of fire climate studies from the western United States, including tree ring and charcoal-based studies. And so these are from landscape scale to regional scale studies of fire and climate. And this is a place where you can access some of the tree ring literature as well as the charcoal climate literature, and see more or less some of the state-of-the-art work in trying to understand these longer-term patterns from interannual timescales to centuries and millennia. Just as an example of the kinds of things that we're learning from these long records, the long fire history records from the paleo and also from modern records, are the spatial temporal patterns. And in particular, a lot of the research in the last 10 years or so is focused on some of these persistent features of the ocean atmosphere system, like the El Nino Southern Oscillation and the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And there's a variety of other ocean atmosphere patterns, these planetary waves, as Bill referred to them, that affect climate in different ways in different regions. And as an example, on the left, you see these are correlations between the tree ring fire history records and the the El Nino and the PDO records, and they show these distinctive patterns, such as the so-called dipole of the Pacific Northwest and the Southwest, typically of the U.S. being out of phase. When you have a high fire year in the Southwest, typically you have a low fire year in the Northwest and vice versa. And this shows up in the modern data, and it shows up in precipitation data, and it's partly a function of El Nino, not entirely, but partly. And so these patterns, these spatial temporal patterns, have just been really discovered in the last 10 or 20 years in climatology, and now the fire climatology is also evaluating them and seeing to what degree fire patterns over large spatial scales and longer time scales relate to these patterns. And there's some utility here for forecasting, for scenarios looking into the future. And I'll come back to that. Mark Kaib showed this graph at the bottom from the Westerland Science paper. There is an increasing body of evidence that warming temperatures in regions, different parts of the planet, particularly the higher latitudes, Canada, Siberia, elsewhere, beginning to see increases in numbers of large fires, particularly in forest areas, that are probably related to the warming temperatures. And in this study, we showed particularly that the highest fire occurrence years seem to be related to the years where springs were occurring the earliest, that is, early snow melt, warm springs allowing the snow to come off the mountains earlier, thus leading to a longer, drier fire season. And so the evidence is building that there's fire-climate relations here, particularly warming temperatures. But one shouldn't extrapolate this, over-extrapolate this to all elevations and all forest types. These patterns are not the same in different parts of the western U.S. even. We see different patterns and different climate fire associations. This is a recent paper published that evaluates to a little finer scale with these Bailey ecoregions that Bill referred to. So down to the ecoregion level, it's a little more specific to the vegetation, and you find different fire-climate relationships, as you might expect, in these different vegetation zones and different elevations. And this paper shows that one can actually model, you can statistically model the fire relationships with a fairly small number of climate variables, actually do explain a significant amount of the variability in fire activity, but again, varying quite a bit from one area to another. This is another paper I find interesting, and it highlights actually some of the uncertainty about recent fire occurrence changes. If you look at the top right here, you'll see this is the area burned record for the Northern Rockies, and you'll see a lot of area burned in the early decades of the 20th century, and then a lot of area burned in the recent decades. And this is this pattern that we're seeing of rising areas burned in larger fires, and it tends to be related to these warmer spring temperatures, drier conditions, but it also is related to the PDO in part. The Pacific Decadal Oscillation is in a decadal phase that tends to promote drier, warmer conditions in the northern tier of states. And so what I'm saying is that, that some of the changes that we're seeing in regions like the western United States may not be entirely, or actually may be partly related to global warming trends. It may also be related to these oscillatory patterns of the ocean and atmosphere. There's still quite a bit of uncertainty about the natural variability and causes of these interannual decadal scale patterns. Incidentally, here's the temperature history for the whole United States. This is the contiguous United States temperature just for March, just for the month of March. And you'll just note these really warm springs that have occurred in the last 20 years or so across the United States, and actually much warmer in the western U.S. than the east. And I point out, since this is 2010 this year, this is the 1910 fire year, had the warmest March of the entire record of the national record going back to 1895. And here, by the way, is the temperature anomaly for 1910 relative to the 1950 to 1995 average. So there very likely wasn't a relationship, because this early spring drying condition and then some later changes in warming during the summer and dry conditions in the summer of 1910, as well as the winds, of course, had a big factor in the Great Idaho Fires of 1910. I wanted to say just a bit about pyrogeography. This is, I think, an area of development also in fire climate and understanding fire-climate relationships. And Bill talked about this quite a bit. I think it's that where we're at with fire climatology is a bit like the early classification systems of climate, the Kirpin classification that Bill referred to, for example. And this is from the classic fire meteorology book by Schrader and Buck, and they developed these regional classifications, and they showed these climograms of precipitation. And we see when we look at the modern data sets that we have of area burn, one can develop similar kinds of graphics of the regional patterns. For example, these are time series of area burned and numbers of fires by lightning and human caused in different parts of the United States based on the land fire or the Schmidt et al. Data set. And just as an example, here's the Arizona Ponderosa Pine Zone versus the Southern California Chaparral. And the black bars are areas burned by lightning, and the open bars are areas burned by human set fires, and the black dots are amount of area burned by month by lightning, and open or amount of area burned by humans. And the point of this is that we have a great deal of diversity in these fire patterns, different regions, different causal factors of lightning and humans, and these are climate related and vegetation related. And the point of all this is that there's a great deal of variability, and this is what complicates predicting and understanding fire climate relationships, and also communicating to the public the variations that are out there, both in human and lightning causes. Just now, finally wrapping up here, there's a number of online data sets and tools for visualizing climate, and I think there's going to be an increasing number of these in coming years with support from Joint Fire Sciences. For example, Bill Sommers and colleagues are leading a syntheses effort, and so am I and a group of other scientists are leading a synthesis of fire climate knowledge that we hope to make more available to fire managers and decision makers and researchers. This is one site you can find at the University of Oregon, Western U.S. Fire and Climate Research. Now, the other tools that are online that are, I think, going to be increasingly valuable for planning purposes, and particularly at regional scales rather than district level. This is more, I think, at national scale planning and regional scale planning is the forecasts that are available from the climate models, the statistical models and dynamical models that the NOAA and other sources have been providing these outlooks of long lead outlooks which can be useful for thinking about upcoming fire seasons. Just as an example, this is the predicted precipitation probabilities on the left and temperature on the right, and generally showing warmer temperatures through the May, June, July period of this coming season in the western United States. Not too surprising, but above average temperatures. And the El Nino is weakening now, so probably a decreased effect there. But you have these available outlook tools online that one can use to think about fire seasons, upcoming fire seasons in the immediate future. And the Predictive Services Group at the National Interagency Fire Center have also been meeting annually and producing these seasonal outlooks, which include also a narrative explanation of anticipated patterns. And sometimes they can't make a prediction for particular regions because there's just no statistical power and no reliable way of estimating for a particular region in a particular year. But these are useful sources of information on interannual climate variability, and I think these are the kind of tools we'll be seeing more of. And I don't know that we'll get to a point where we can forecast with high accuracy out more than a few years. The scenarios, the global change scenarios, as Bill Sommers was describing, are just that. They're tools for really assessing what some of the conditions may be in a more general sense. And I think they're likely to be, for some time to come, really more useful at the regional scales than down to finer scales. So with that, I'll stop, and hopefully we'll still have some time for questions.